The alien girl thought that human warriors were just fairy tales. Lyra had always been told that the stories of human warriors were nothing but fairy tales. In the peaceful world of Xanthia, where her people lived in harmony with nature, such tales seemed too distant, too impossible. Humans, they said, were myths, warriors with unmatched strength, courage, and skill. But Lyra had never met one, and she certainly never thought she would. Her life had always been sheltered, tucked away in the serene forests of Xanthia. The idea of humans, fierce and warlike, felt far removed from her reality. Yet now, her life was about to be upended by the very people she had thought were nothing more than stories to comfort the weak. Captured by the Krath, a ruthless, violent alien race, Lyra found herself aboard a warship that rumbled through space, bound for a distant, unknown planet. The Krath had no interest in mercy. They lived for conquest, and to them, Xanthia was just another insignificant planet to be pillaged. The stories of humans came back to her in flashes as she stared out of the cold, metal bars of her cell. The tales painted humans as legendary warriors, capable of slaying entire armies with a single strike. Yet here she was, trapped and helpless, feeling the sting of those old stories becoming nothing but empty words. The Krath soldiers laughed as they walked past her, their cruel eyes glinting with malice. She tried not to show her fear, but it was there, thick in her chest. She had always believed that her world, her peaceful existence, would last forever. Now it was slipping through her fingers like sand. What could one small alien girl do against an army that had wiped out entire civilizations? The days blurred together in the cell. The Krath didn't care for prisoners. They cared only about the next victory, the next conquest. Every day, Lyra's resolve grew weaker, her hope fading like the stars outside her window. But even in this dark place, her mind clung to the stories of brave human warriors who would appear at the most unexpected times, saving those in need. And then one day the unthinkable happened. A rumble shook the Krath warship. Lyra froze, her heart racing. It wasn't the usual tremors from the ship's engines. This was different. The ship shuddered again, harder this time, as if it were being struck by something massive. The lights flickered. There was a sudden loud echoing noise, the sound of a violent explosion from somewhere deep within the vessel. The Krath soldiers ran, shouting orders in their harsh language. Lyra's cell door swung open and she tensed, expecting the worst. But instead of a Krath officer, a figure appeared in the doorway. Tall, broad-shouldered, and armed with a weapon that gleamed under the dim lights of the corridor, the figure didn't look like anyone Lyra had ever seen. It was a human. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Lyra stared in disbelief. She had never imagined a human would look like this, strong, imposing, and calm in the face of danger. Her mind raced. Had they come to rescue her? But why? What did they want with a simple alien girl? The human's eyes met hers, a quiet understanding passing between them. Without a word, he raised his weapon, stepping aside to allow a team of soldiers behind him to advance. They were humans too, all wearing armor and moving with purpose. Lyra couldn't quite grasp the scene unfolding before her. These humans, real humans, not the mythic figures of her childhood, were storming a Krath ship with precision and confidence. She watched as one soldier moved past her cell, knocking out a Krath guard with a single blow. The human commander, who seemed to be in charge, turned back to Lyra and spoke, his voice steady and clear. "We're here to get you out of here. You're safe now." Lyra couldn't find her voice. Safe? How could she be safe on a ship full of armed soldiers fighting a war? She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her mind struggled to comprehend what was happening. She had heard stories of human warriors before, but seeing them in action was something entirely different. The commander nodded, sensing her confusion. "I know you're scared. We'll explain everything later. But right now we need to move. The Krath won't stop coming." Lyra stood, still unsure whether this was a dream or reality. Her legs trembled and her hands shook. She had never been a warrior. She was the daughter of peaceful Xanthian scholars, trained to think, to reason, not to fight. But these humans, they weren't afraid. Their very presence felt like a storm, unstoppable and fierce. She wondered if she had been wrong all along, if the fairy tales were more real than she had ever imagined. The commander gestured for her to follow, leading her through the maze of corridors. The sounds of battle echoed from all sides, but the humans moved with unwavering focus, as though nothing could distract them. Lyra marveled at the way they moved, coordinated, swift, and precise. Each soldier seemed to know exactly where to go, what to do. There was no hesitation, no fear, just determination. Lyra found herself walking among them, her doubts beginning to fall away with each step. These were not the warriors she had heard about in stories. They were real, and they were fighting for something far greater than themselves. Finally, they reached an exit, and Lyra stepped out onto the metal deck of the Vanguard, the human ship that had come to rescue her. The sight before her was overwhelming. The ship was massive, its hull sleek and black, covered in advanced technology that Lyra couldn't even begin to understand. But what caught her attention the most were the soldiers, each one a living testament to the strength and courage that made human warriors so legendary. She couldn't help but feel a mix of awe and fear. These were not the peaceful beings she had known. These were the warriors of the fairy tales, and they were real. Commander Jace turned to her, his expression stern but kind. "We're not done yet, Lyra. We still have a mission to complete, but you're not alone, not anymore." Lyra didn't know what to say. She had come from a world that didn't know war, a place where stories of human warriors seemed like little more than fantasy. But now, standing on this alien ship surrounded by humans who fought with honor and purpose, she realized the truth. The stories were real. And she, too, was a part of them now. Lyra stood in awe as the Vanguard soared through space, its engines humming steadily as the battle above the Krath warship came to an end. She could still hear the faint echoes of laser fire and the thundering explosions from below deck, but everything felt surreal now. She had been rescued, freed by the very warriors she had once thought were nothing more than myths. The humans moved quickly and efficiently, securing the ship and ensuring that all the Krath forces had been neutralized. Lyra had never seen soldiers like this before. They moved with a calm intensity, their eyes sharp, their movements calculated. There was no panic, no confusion, just an overwhelming sense of purpose. Lyra found herself wondering how they managed to stay so focused, even after the chaos she had witnessed. Commander Jace, the one who had spoken to her earlier, had led the charge. He seemed to be everywhere at once, giving orders, checking the status of his crew, and making sure everyone was safe. His voice, though stern, carried an air of confidence that Lyra couldn't help but admire. It was clear to her now that these humans were far from the fragile creatures she had imagined. They weren't afraid of the Krath. They weren't afraid of anything. As the Vanguard left the Krath warship behind and began its journey to the safety of human space, Lyra was taken to a small room near the ship's medical bay. It was simple but comfortable. There was a bed, a small desk, and a chair. It wasn't much, but it was a far cry from the cold, metal cell she had spent the last few days in. Lyra sat on the bed, her mind racing. She had so many questions, but there was no one around to ask. She could still hardly believe it. The human warriors, the myths of her childhood, were real. She had seen them fight, seen them command their ship with ease, and she had seen them risk their lives to save hers. It was all so overwhelming. She looked out the small window beside her, watching the stars streak by as the ship moved through the vast emptiness of space. Her thoughts turned back to her people, the peaceful Xanthians. They had always been content to live in harmony with their world, avoiding conflict and war at all costs. They had believed in peace, in diplomacy, and in the idea that all creatures in the galaxy could coexist. But that had all changed when the Krath attacked. The memory of the Krath soldiers, their cruel faces and cold eyes, sent a shiver down her spine. She could still hear their laughter, feel their hands grabbing her, pulling her onto their ship. She had been nothing more than a prize to them, a trophy to flaunt. She had never imagined a world like that could exist, a world where violence and war were the rule, not the exception. Lyra's thoughts were interrupted when the door to her room opened. Commander Jace stepped inside, his expression serious but not unkind. "You doing all right?" he asked, his voice soft. Lyra looked up at him, a bit surprised. She had expected him to be busy with the mission, but here he was, checking on her. I'm okay," she replied, her voice quieter than she intended. I can't believe any of this. I never thought I'd be rescued by humans. I thought you were just stories." Jace nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "I know," he said. "We get that a lot, myths, legends, but we're real, and we're here to help you, Lyra. You don't have to be afraid anymore." Lyra studied him for a moment, her mind still trying to wrap around the idea. She had always heard about human warriors in stories, tall, strong, and brave. But now, standing in front of her was a man who was all of those things and more. He wasn't just a character from a story. He was real, and he was offering her something she had never imagined: safety, protection, and hope. "I've heard the stories," Lyra said slowly, "about how humans can fight, how they can defeat even the strongest enemies. But I never thought it was true. I thought it was just fairy tales." Jace smiled, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "I get it. Most people don't believe it until they see it for themselves, but we're not some kind of magical creatures. We're just humans. We fight because we have to, because it's who we are." Lyra furrowed her brow, still trying to understand. "But why? Why fight so much? Why risk your lives for people you don't even know?" Jace's smile faded, and he took a seat across from her. "It's not about fighting for people we don't know. It's about fighting for what's right, for freedom, for the ones we care about, and for the people who can't fight for themselves." Lyra nodded, her heart swelling with something she hadn't expected: respect. These humans, these warriors, weren't fighting for glory or power. They were fighting for something far greater. It was a concept she had never fully understood before, but now, sitting across from Jace, it was becoming clearer. "So what happens now?" she asked, still feeling the weight of everything that had happened. "Where do I go? What do I do?" Jace leaned back in his chair, his eyes thoughtful. "We're taking you to a human safe zone. It's far from here, but it's the best place for you to recover. We'll make sure you're safe, Lyra. No one's going to hurt you again." Lyra felt a flicker of hope in her chest. A safe place. She hadn't felt safe since the Krath had attacked, but now, for the first time, she felt as though she might have a chance. These humans, these warriors, were offering her something more than just rescue. They were offering her a future. "I don't know how to thank you," she said quietly, her voice filled with gratitude. Jace's expression softened. "You don't have to thank us, it's what we do. We help when we can." Lyra stared at him for a moment, her mind still trying to process everything. These humans, these warriors, were real. They weren't the fairy tales she had grown up hearing. They were something more, something stronger. They weren't just fighting for survival, they were fighting for something worth believing in. As Jace stood to leave, Lyra felt a sense of peace settle over her. The war was far from over, but for the first time she felt as though she had a chance. A chance to survive, to rebuild, and to perhaps one day tell her people the truth about the humans, that the warriors they thought were just stories were, in fact, the bravest and strongest beings in the galaxy. And as the door closed behind Jace, Lyra felt a new determination rising within her. She wasn't just a helpless captive anymore. She was part of something bigger now. And she would do everything she could to repay the humans for saving her, to prove that their courage was not in vain. Lyra stood near the observation deck of the Vanguard, watching the stars pass by in a blur of white streaks. The ship was moving at an incredible speed, far beyond anything she had ever seen. But it wasn't just the technology that fascinated her. It was the humans. The more she saw them, the more she realized how much she had misunderstood them. Her thoughts drifted back to the peaceful world of Xanthia. She had been raised to believe that war was something to avoid at all costs. Her people valued knowledge, meditation, and harmony. Conflict was seen as a failure, an example of a society that had lost its way. But here, among the humans, she was beginning to understand that sometimes war was not just a matter of survival. It was about protecting what mattered most. The soldiers of the Vanguard were nothing like the merciless Krath. There was a depth to them that Lyra had never expected. They were not soldiers for the sake of war. They fought because they believed in something greater than themselves. It was this belief that made them formidable, that made them unyielding in the face of danger. Commander Jace had become someone Lyra admired deeply. He was not the tall, untouchable figure she had imagined when she first saw him. Instead, he was grounded, thoughtful, and above all, compassionate. He had taken the time to speak with her, to understand her fears and doubts, even when the rest of his crew was caught up in the urgency of the mission. He had shared stories of his past, of his experiences fighting on distant planets, and of the people he had lost along the way. Lyra had learned that Jace's strength didn't come from his physical power alone. It came from his sense of duty, his unwavering commitment to those who couldn't protect themselves. And it was this strength that she needed now, as she began to realize that she could no longer simply stand by and be a passive observer. She had to find her own strength, to face the challenges ahead with the same courage that Jace and his team had shown. But that wasn't easy. The memories of the Krath still haunted her. She could hear their voices in her head, see their cruel faces whenever she closed her eyes. She had been captured so easily, thrown onto their ship like a worthless object. What if the same thing happened again? What if she wasn't strong enough to protect herself? Lyra was snapped from her thoughts by the sound of the door opening behind her. She turned to see Jace standing in the doorway, his eyes scanning the room before landing on her. "You okay?" he asked, his voice steady as always. Lyra hesitated before nodding. "I'm fine, just thinking." Jace stepped closer, leaning against the railing beside her. "About the mission?" She shook her head. "About everything. The Krath, the way they treated me, I just feel so useless. I can't help anyone like this." Jace regarded her for a moment, then gave her a small, understanding smile. "You're not useless, Lyra. You're stronger than you realize. You've already shown more courage than most people ever will." Lyra frowned, unsure. "But I didn't do anything. I was just taken." "That wasn't your fault," Jace said firmly. "The Krath are ruthless. They've been doing this for a long time. But you survived, didn't you? You're here now, and that's because you're strong enough to be here." His words gave her something to hold on to, a lifeline in the middle of the uncertainty that threatened to overwhelm her. Maybe, just maybe, he was right. She had survived. She had made it through the worst of it. But there was still so much to do, so much she still had to learn. "We're heading to a Krath stronghold," Jace continued, his tone serious. "We need to rescue a group of civilians who have been captured. It's going to be dangerous, but we can't leave them there." Lyra felt her stomach tighten. The thought of going into another battle, facing the Krath again, filled her with dread. But at the same time, she knew she couldn't run from it. She couldn't just stay hidden and hope it would all go away. "What do you need me to do?" she asked quietly, surprising herself with the words. Jace studied her for a moment before nodding. "You're going to help us get in. We've done the recon, but we need someone who knows the Krath's tactics, someone who understands their layout. You're our best shot at getting the civilians out alive." Lyra swallowed hard. She had never imagined being in a situation like this. Back on Xanthia, she had been taught to avoid conflict, to find peaceful solutions. But here, in this galaxy filled with violence, she had no choice but to fight if she wanted to survive, if she wanted to help those who couldn't defend themselves. "Okay," she said, her voice firmer now. "I'll help." Jace smiled again, a flash of approval in his eyes. "Good. We'll need all the help we can get. But remember, Lyra, you don't have to do this alone. We're a team. We protect each other." The words sank in, filling Lyra with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt before. She wasn't just a captive anymore. She wasn't just someone who was waiting to be saved. She was part of something bigger now, part of a group that believed in something worth fighting for. And that, she realized, was all the strength she needed. Later that evening, Lyra sat with the team as they discussed the details of the rescue mission. She watched as Jace and the others strategized, their voices low but filled with authority. Every soldier on the vanguard had a role to play, each one contributing something vital to the mission's success. Lyra had been assigned to work with the tech specialist, a young woman named Kale, who would help her navigate the Krath facility's security systems. Together, they would find a way to disable the enemy's defenses and allow the rest of the team to infiltrate the base. As the meeting concluded, Lyra found herself feeling a sense of camaraderie she had never experienced before. These humans were not just warriors. They were people who cared for each other, who fought not just for themselves, but for those who had no way of defending themselves. She couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude toward them. That night, as she lay in her bunk, Lyra thought about how far she had come in such a short time. From a frightened prisoner to someone who was about to risk her life to help others, it was hard to believe how much had changed. But as the vanguard continued its journey toward the Krath stronghold, Lyra knew that this was only the beginning. The battle ahead would be difficult, but she was ready. The myths of human warriors were no longer just stories to her. They were real, and they were her allies. Together, they would face whatever dangers lay ahead, and they would do it as a team. The vanguard drifted silently in the blackness of space, its engines barely making a sound as it approached the Krath stronghold. Lyra stood at a small window in the corridor, her eyes fixed on the planet below. The Krath base was hidden deep in the mountains of a harsh, unforgiving world, one that seemed to mirror the Krath themselves. It was a place built for war, a place where life meant little to those who lived there. Lyra's mind raced. She had never imagined she would be here, on a ship filled with human warriors, preparing to fight a battle that was far beyond anything she had known. The thought of facing the Krath again filled her with unease. They were ruthless, cold, and methodical. They had captured her once before, and the fear of being taken again gnawed at her. But then she thought of the humans, the warriors who had saved her. They had shown her what it meant to fight for something greater than just survival. They had risked their lives to save hers. Now it was her turn to help. She couldn't turn back, not now. As the Vanguard entered the planet's atmosphere, Lyra joined the rest of the crew in the briefing room. The air was thick with anticipation, but there was also an undeniable sense of purpose. The soldiers around her were focused, their faces set in expressions of quiet determination. Commander Jace stood at the front, his presence commanding the room without him needing to say a word. His crew trusted him. Lyra trusted him too. "This is it," Jace said, his voice steady. "We're going in. The Krath are holding civilians in a compound deep in the mountains. They're being used as leverage in their ongoing campaign. We don't have much time. We need to get them out and neutralize any Krath forces standing in our way." Lyra's heart pounded in her chest. She had been briefed on the mission details, but now that it was real, it felt more dangerous than ever. She wasn't just a passive observer anymore. She was a part of this mission. Jace looked at Lyra, his expression softening for a moment. "Lyra, I know you've never done anything like this before, but you're not alone. We're all in this together." Her throat tightened. She wasn't alone. For the first time, she believed those words. She had found something she never thought she would, a family, a team that fought for each other. There was strength in that. Strength she hadn't realized she had. As the soldiers moved to prepare, Lyra met Kale, the tech specialist she'd been assigned to. Kale was already working on a small device, her hands moving with practiced ease. She smiled at Lyra when she noticed her approach. "Ready to go." Lyra nodded, trying to push past the nerves that tightened in her stomach. "I think so. We've got this," Kale said confidently. "You're gonna be great. Just follow my lead and don't overthink it." Lyra gave a small, grateful smile. Kale's reassurance meant more than she realized. It reminded her of something she had forgotten, that the people around her weren't just warriors, they were also her support system. They would help her find her place in this battle. The shuttle ride to the planet's surface was tense. The ship's controls hummed beneath her fingertips, but the quiet inside the cabin felt heavy with unspoken thoughts. Lyra could feel the weight of what was about to happen, but she focused on her breathing, trying to keep calm. She had been trained, yes, but the reality of combat was something entirely different. She didn't know if she was truly ready for this. When they landed, the soldiers quickly disembarked. Lyra followed Kale closely, trying to remember everything she had learned in the past few hours. They moved swiftly through the rocky terrain, keeping low, their boots crunching on the dry ground. The sky above was a dull gray, the clouds thick and oppressive. It was as though the planet itself mirrored the darkness of the Krath forces that controlled it. They reached the compound's outer perimeter without incident. Lyra's heart raced as she watched the soldiers begin to set up their position, their movements seamless and synchronized. Jace had gone over the plan, but now it was time for action. They were close, too close to turn back. Kale handed Lyra a small communicator and some basic equipment. "Just keep your head down and stay with me," she said quietly. "We'll get through this." Lyra took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. There was no turning back. The Krath were only a few hundred meters away, and the civilians they were here to save needed them. Her legs felt heavy, but she forced herself to move. She had to stay focused. They entered the compound, their movements swift and silent. The air was thick with the scent of metal and smoke. The Krath base was vast, filled with towering structures and heavy security. As they approached the first guard post, Lyra could hear the muffled voices of Krath soldiers in the distance, their alien language harsh and unintelligible. Kale gestured for Lyra to stop. She crouched low, her eyes scanning the area for any signs of movement. "We're close. We've got to disable the security system before we can move in. Stay close." Lyra nodded, her nerves pushing her to act quickly. They worked together, Kale accessing the security terminal while Lyra kept watch. She knew the stakes. They had to be fast. The longer they stayed, the greater the chance the Krath would notice them. As Kale worked her magic on the terminal, Lyra's mind wandered back to her time in captivity. The fear, the helplessness, it had all seemed like a nightmare. But now she was doing something about it. She was taking action, and that felt like something she had never experienced before. The strength that Jace had talked about, the strength that came from fighting for others, was starting to take root inside her. With a soft click, Kale looked up. "We're in. The doors are unlocked. Let's move." They pushed forward, moving swiftly from one guard post to another. Lyra's pulse quickened with every step. She could hear the distant sounds of Krath's soldiers, but they remained undetected. The humans were experts at this. They knew how to work together, how to blend into the shadows and remain unseen. It was a skill that Lyra was beginning to understand. Finally, they reached the building where the civilians were being held. The doors were locked, but Kale was already working on the control panel. "Almost there," she whispered. Lyra could feel her heartbeat in her throat. She knew the civilians were inside, waiting for their freedom. The door finally opened with a soft hiss, and Kale motioned for Lyra to enter first. Inside, the room was dimly lit, the air stale and heavy. There were several civilians huddled together, their faces weary but hopeful. They looked up as the door opened, their eyes wide with surprise and relief. Lyra felt a rush of emotions flood her chest. These people had been imprisoned by the Krath, held hostage for reasons they couldn't understand. They had been forgotten, abandoned, until now. She stepped forward, her voice trembling as she spoke. "You're free now, we're here to get you out." The civilians stared at her for a moment, disbelief on their faces. But then, slowly, one by one, they stood up, their eyes bright with the possibility of escape. Kale quickly got to work, preparing the evac systems. The rest of the team would be here soon to help escort the civilians to safety. But for now, Lyra could only watch as the people she was helping began to move toward freedom. The sounds of approaching Krath soldiers grew louder, and Lyra's breath caught in her throat. They couldn't afford to stay here much longer. The countdown had begun and the Krath would be on them any minute. "Let's go," Kale urged. "We don't have much time." Lyra nodded, feeling a newfound resolve. She had come here to help, and now she was doing it. This wasn't just a mission anymore. It was her fight, too. The human warriors had taught her that. She wasn't just a bystander. She was part of something that mattered. And no matter how dangerous it got, she wasn't going to stop fighting. The chaos of battle raged around them as the humans and the Krath clashed in the narrow hallways of the compound. Lyra's heart pounded in her chest as she hurried along behind Kale, the tech specialist who was guiding the group of civilians toward the extraction point. They had barely made it out of the main building when the Krath forces began to surround them. The sound of blaster fire and explosions echoed through the compound, rattling the walls. Lyra's nerves were stretched thin, but she pushed forward, determined to see this mission through. The civilians, frightened but trusting, followed closely behind. Lyra glanced over her shoulder every few seconds, making sure the Krath hadn't found them yet. She could hear the enemy soldiers shouting in their harsh, guttural language, but the humans had trained for this. They knew how to move without being seen, how to stay one step ahead of their pursuers. It was a skill that Lyra was beginning to understand, and it filled her with a sense of confidence she hadn't thought possible. As they reached the outer edge of the compound, Kale quickly signaled for Lyra to stop. "We're almost there," she whispered, her voice tense. "The extraction point is just ahead, but we need to stay low. If we're spotted now, it's all over." Lyra nodded, trying to steady her breathing. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. One mistake could mean disaster, but she wasn't just following orders anymore. She was part of this team. She had to be strong. She had to help. They moved forward cautiously, their footsteps silent on the rocky ground. The compound was surrounded by high walls and armed sentries, but the humans had planned for every possibility. They had anticipated the Krath's movements and had already taken out the outer perimeter guards. The path to the extraction point was clear, but it wouldn't stay that way for long. Just as they reached the edge of the compound, the unmistakable sound of Krath footsteps echoed from behind. Lyra's heart skipped a beat. She turned to see a group of Krath soldiers rounding the corner, their weapons raised and their eyes scanning the area. Kale didn't hesitate. "Get down," she ordered, pulling Lyra and the civilians to the ground behind a stack of crates. The Krath soldiers came into view, their heavy boots thudding against the dirt. Lyra held her breath, praying that they wouldn't spot them. She could hear the Krath murmuring to each other, their voices sharp and urgent. They were close, too close. Her pulse raced, and she had to fight the urge to panic. Kale pulled out a small device from her belt and quickly began typing commands into it. The device emitted a faint beep, and suddenly the lights in the compound flickered. The Krath soldiers, momentarily distracted, looked up in confusion. It was just the break they needed. "Now!" Kale hissed, and in an instant they were on the move again. They sprinted for the extraction point, the sounds of the Krath soldiers' pursuit growing louder behind them. Lyra could feel the weight of every step, her legs burning from the effort. She didn't stop. She couldn't, not now. They reached the extraction point just as a transport shuttle appeared overhead, its engines roaring. The door slid open, and the soldiers began ushering the civilians inside. Jace was at the front, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of danger. He caught sight of Lyra and Kale, motioning them forward. "Come on, we're almost there," Jace shouted. Lyra's heart soared as she ran toward the shuttle, the civilians closed behind. The shuttle's hatch began to close just as the first shots rang out from the Krath soldiers who had finally caught up to them. The sound of blaster fire echoed in the air, and Lyra felt a sharp sting on her shoulder as she dove into the shuttle. She landed hard on the floor, gasping for breath. The door slammed shut behind her, and the shuttle shot into the sky, its engines blasting through the atmosphere. Lyra looked out the small window, watching the Krath compound grow smaller and smaller as they ascended into space. They had made it. They had actually made it. The shuttle's interior was filled with the sounds of heavy breathing, the civilians whispering in disbelief and relief. They were safe. They had been rescued. Lyra sat back against the wall, her mind still processing everything that had just happened. She could still hear the Krath soldiers' shouts, but they were growing fainter by the second. She had faced her fear, had fought alongside the humans who had once been nothing more than stories to her. And she had survived. She had helped. Commander Jace approached her, his face hard and focused, but there was something in his eyes that softened when he saw her. "You did good, Lyra. You kept your head in a bad situation." Lyra gave him a tired smile. "I had help," Jace chuckled. "We all do. No one fights alone." The shuttle's engines hummed as it made its way toward the human safe zone. The civilians, exhausted but grateful, began to settle into the seats, their eyes filled with the quiet understanding that they had survived the worst. Lyra looked around at them, her heart swelling with pride. They had done it. They had saved lives. They had given these people a chance at a future. As the shuttle continued its journey, Lyra reflected on everything she had learned over the past few days. She had come to this planet as a scared, helpless prisoner, unsure of what would happen to her. But now, she was different. She wasn't the same person who had been taken by the Krath. She had fought. She had survived. And in doing so, she had become part of something greater than herself. The humans had taught her the value of fighting for others. They had shown her that sometimes, even in the darkest of times, there was hope. They had risked their lives to save her, and now she had done the same for others. The fairy tales she had heard as a child had become her reality. And as she looked out at the stars, Lyra knew one thing for sure: she would never forget what it meant to be part of this team, part of this fight. She had a purpose now. A purpose that went beyond survival. For the first time since the Krath had attacked her home, Lyra felt truly free. The battle wasn't over, but she was no longer afraid. She knew that no matter what came next, she had the strength to face it.